Hello, we are live. Fourth episode of Where Peter Is Live. I'm your host, Rachel Amiri. I'm production editor for wherepeteris.com. And I'm joined today by a very special guest, along with our regular contributors. But we have Bishop Richard Umbers from Sydney, Australia. Welcome. And we also have Mike Lewis.
I suppose I should be saying g'day or something like that.
Good day, mate.
That's what we would expect. And we're also joined by the lovely Melinda Ribnek, contributor at WPI. So, Bishop Umbers, we talked before you would like to lead us in a short prayer before we kind of get going here. So if you could start for us.
Sure. Well, look, today is Friday.
Not for us, but for you it is.
We'll get a preview of Friday.
We'll see what's coming up.
Yeah.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, open our hearts to your grace, restrain us from all human waywardness, and keep us faithful to your commandments. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever. Amen.
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 In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
And I just want to pause right now because you did that right. That last little part. That God forever and ever.
One God, yeah.
And I don't know if all of our 11 viewers have heard about that or know exactly what that is. So we're keeping it light, but I just we haven't written an article about why it's
Cardinal Sarah that came through to all the bishops explaining the change in the liturgy. And the idea behind this is to emphasize the Trinitarian nature of that closing prayer.
So there you go.
Yeah.
So
so Mike invited you onto our show today, Bishop, because you have a very prominent, I guess, social media presence in Catholic Twitter as kind of the lighthearted jokester, comic relief of Catholic Twitter.
As an auxiliary, you have more freedom of movement, I suppose, between
more
meetings.
Flexibility.
Yeah, the thing is, it is basically I'm just having probably a bit too much fun. I'll get it knocked out of me at some stage.
We greatly appreciate that. We need that little bit of fun on Catholic Twitter. It helps so much. Yeah,
it's a ministry of memes, really, is what we could call it.
I actually do other stuff. I really do other things. I have to work on that.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about your meme technique, because you put up at least a meme or two a day, right? And it doesn't look like you're using professional software, or are you using Photoshop, or are you just Microsoft Word and like pulling words in front of it, or what's?
There's a few simple photo editors on iTunes, so I just downloaded them.
Okay.
PixArt is one. Another photo editor is another. It's very, very simple to use.
So basically, for those of you who have been spending too much time looking at conspiracy theories on social media, download these programs and you can make fun memes instead of...
I just want to say, too, that the good bishop has promised about 15 minutes ago on Twitter that I would be the subject of his next meme. And so I have graciously offered a ton of content from my 1,000, aka 7 kids, and a bunny. So you let me know what works for you, Bishop, and I got you.
All right. Well, I'll see what the latest meme format is, and then it'll be a challenge. Yeah, I'll work on it.
So before we get into the really serious subjects, how is Melinda just brought up bunnies? How is the bunny problem doing these days in Australia? The rabbit-proof fence, and you don't know anything about that.
We get various biblical plagues from time to time. Could be rats, could be bunnies, could be locusts, could be that's just
tarantulas. Do you get? I mean, that's not biblical.
No, we have our own poisonous spiders. I think our spiders would eat your spiders.
Yeah, I've heard that in Australia, the animals are so poisonous, and I have to ask, like, do you guys take that personally from God, or like, how?
No, it's all good. There's a movie, in fact, which is one of the worst movies ever made, called After Earth. And I wonder whether it wasn't really about Australia. Where everything's out
After
to
Australia.
There are a lot of
bit
good.
like that. You go down to the local beach, you go to Bondi Beach, and you look at the signs, and it's going, just for warning, there are, and then it goes through the list of things from sharks to jellyfish to rips to riptides where you get swept out and drown. Just about everything can be dumped onto the sand and have your neck broken. It's but other than that, enjoy.
Right. Right. I'll be there next week.
See, here's the thing. People who have never been to Australia or to your native country, New Zealand, are fascinated. Just like blown away by the idea of Australia. I mean, the kangaroos and that big rock thing that's red.
They are everywhere. Like I go for jogs sometimes, and I have to jog past kangaroos, and they just sort of stand there looking. But you have to be a bit careful because even the kangaroos could actually break your neck if they were to kick you. They'd lean back on their tail and give you. They'd be worse than a horse.
Yeah.
Wow. Is that a real thing, or are you like pulling our chain?
No,
Oh no, they can mess you up.
Like,
Now,
Australians, they're cute little kangaroos.
If I was pulling your chain, I'd be talking about the drop bears. Do you know the drop bears? If you go, there's actually Google it, and you'll go to the website from the government about drop bears. There you go. That's Australia.
Okay. Now we have a.
Happy to go.
We are all against.
Now, have you ever encountered? Now, one of my favorite YouTube videos of all time is the guy who gets into a boxing match with the kangaroo.
Yes,
and
I know. Very dangerous.
You shouldn't do that, though. That's okay. Tourists should not attempt that.
It was to rescue his dog.
Yeah, his dog was being attacked by the deadly kangaroo, and he gets a couple of.
It's
incredible.
But that's one of the kangaroos just surprised what's going on. I mean, the kangaroos are not very bright. They're like oversized mice.
Ew.
But mice that pack a punch. Yeah.
Wow, I significantly like kangaroos less after this conversation. Like, it's astounding. I never thought of it like that.
Gerard Wong from YouTube can confirm that kangaroos are indeed dangerous. So
I hope that's not from personal experience. But
yeah, if any of you have any super intelligent Australia questions like that, feel free to like that I had. Like for example, so you are abstaining from meat right now because it is afternoon on Friday.
On Friday.
And here it is, 8 p.m. for me. It's 7 p.m. for Rachel, and it's 5 p.m. for Melinda. And
I flew to Los Angeles, and I arrived before I left.
Wow.
Oh, crazy.
It's very strange.
So I left at something like 10 o'clock in the morning, and I arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning, or 6 o'clock in the morning.
Excellent.
So praying the divine office was quite a challenge. Like, the way back.
Yeah.
How can you manage being a priest, let alone a bishop, in a land of so much wonder and time travel and excitement?
That's time travel. That's all.
And fighting kangaroos.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear from Bishop Richard all about kangaroos, but also about talk to us maybe about like your online ministry, because I've been on Twitter, Catholic Twitter, for 6 months, and I have to tell you, like, it's been a ride. So since we have you for a little bit, can you talk about what it's like being an online bishop and some observations that you have?
Well, so my background as a priest has always been in chaplaincy, especially with university students. So when Twitter first came out, one of my spiritual directees was saying to me, hey, you got to check out Twitter. It is you. And so that was over 10 years ago. Now, I've been through various, there's times when I've got logged on and I was logged off and then went back on again and went off again. So, but I've been there for more than 10 years. And it is, when I first started out, I was sort of like hunting atheists and pinning them to the ground and having fun, besting them philosophically. But that was really, I mean, beating up on an online atheist is really like shooting fish in a barrel. So then I had to become a little bit more serious and tried basically just tweeting the catechism. And look, things have gone from there basically. So I would normally be on a platform like Twitter. Just recently, I've gone on to Instagram and put the memes there. Facebook, I've kind of neglected a little bit, even though that's where there are the most followers. Most of the parishioners would see what I do on Facebook. I've gotten very boring on Facebook, I think, and I just put up articles now. So it's a work in progress. But certainly being online, I think one of the issues is you have to, in saying be yourself, you do need to be Catholic, even when you're mucking around. And that does mean, well, in the same way that you talk to someone in real life, it is real life. You are talking to someone in real life. You'd have the same, I guess, politeness as well, even if you are being a bit edgy. So the thing of unfortunately, like you get reply guys, and you've got to ask yourself, okay, there's a reason why you're not getting the communication that you might be asking for if the only thing you do is just comment in an abrasive way on the first thing that comes up.
What are some other ways that you think people need to act like a Catholic online? Like, what are some other examples you can think of in terms of, like, you're following along on a conversation on Twitter? What are some things you notice?
Well, look, I mean, there are ways and ways of engaging intelligently. You can disagree intelligently, no problem. I mean, in one of the real purposes of Twitter, I think, is to discover other ways of thinking. And I've, if you look at the people that I follow, you won't find any pattern because there's all sorts. And in general, it's people that I think it's worth having a conversation with, even though we actually have very, very different beliefs. But anyone who's simply on a rant, look, in real life, you avoid that kind of a person. It's the same for Twitter.
One of the things that I've noticed, maybe that's a little bit different. I mean, so there are all kinds of bishops on social media. And then I would say the vast majority of bishops barely even know what social media is. There are some that I think maybe tweet out a Bible verse or the saint of the day. There are others that maybe tweet out a mini version of their diocesan paper column, so very staid, very formal. And they might even be having someone do that for them. It's like, oh, we need social media. So
very likely.
I'll have my assistant tweet out. I mean, that's what Pope Francis does, really. He doesn't get into the muck with with people.
No, in fact, Pope Francis does not do any of that personally. That's all. He will see what is said, so he will see the tweet, but the others will actually do the work for him.
That's so interesting. So you think Pope Francis actually sees some of the replies?
He does.
Note to self.
Yeah, no. They'll put that before him, but then they will actually decide what goes in and how it's put out there and everything. But no, he does have that input into it. But he's not there. Like, he's not there with the computer, sort of, surfing the net or doing anything like that.
Yeah.
It's like when the the CEO gets like the news clippings packet in the morning probably and gets to flip through and see what his assistants have curated for him. I know that Where Peter Is has at least once been in that pile of things because we for a little while we had Daniele Palmer writing for us, and his dad was the Reverend Tony Palmer, the evangelical minister charismatic minister who died in a motorcycle accident in 2015. But his son Daniele actually wrote for us, and I know that something that he wrote, he told me, got put into the packet so that the Pope could see what he was up to. So I don't think that's the amount of awareness that I know. Now I know Pope Francis is aware of you, or at least you've met him several times, correct?
Yes.
And today
true.
is true. Tomorrow for you and 2 days from now for us is going to be the 8th anniversary of Pope Francis's election as Pope. I was wondering if you could share maybe a little bit about what you know of him as a man, maybe,
maybe
what you thought when he first became Pope. Had you heard of him, or had you you know.
Oh, well, yeah. So the thing is, when he first became Pope, I remember that very well because it was early morning in Australia. And so I was in the university residence and everyone was crowded around the television, to see what was going to happen. And I was actually making fun of the whole thing of, Obemus Papa. And sure enough, it was exactly as I'd sort of imitated the whole thing. I won't do it here because I have to be a bit more respectful. But then as the guy was saying it, he was going, Cardinalos Georgios. And then one of the priests there said, Pell, like that. He was going, yeah, it's Australian. I was going, oh, it can't be. And it wasn't.
I thought it was Cardinal Francis George because of George and Francis.
I have met Cardinal George when I was a seminarian in Rome. So he was a very cerebral guy. But this Bergoglio, I had never heard of this Cardinal Bergoglio. And I was going, who? And then, I was out with the phone and Wikipedia and all the rest, and like, who's this? So I was really puzzled. Like, I had no idea. Some Argentinian cardinal. I hadn't really followed. Those who knew were aware of who he was, but I had no knowledge. But it was over time, and then shortly afterwards, so a few years later, I was actually named as a bishop, and so then I went to Rome for bishop school. And we got to meet with the Holy Father, and I spoke to him in Spanish because I've lived in Spain. And each time I do that, I think he's always a little bit taken aback, and he'll maybe speak to me a few words in Spanish or in Italian, because he gets confused. I'm supposed to be from Australia, but I'm speaking to him in Spanish, and it's like, what? But I did spend a good amount of, so I've met the Holy Father on a number of occasions, but I did spend a good amount of time at the ad limina visit, where all the bishops of a country get together and they meet with the Holy Father, and we actually go each day to a different basilica and pray before a tomb of the apostle and celebrate Mass together and pray the creed together as a sign of unity. And that's very moving. But when we had the audience with the Holy Father, there was 40 of us, all the bishops of Australia. We were 2.5 hours more. We could have been there all day, really. It was wonderful. I was actually pretty pumped at the end of it. But the Holy Father's the kind of person who, he's very grandfatherly in some ways, and you'd really, really love him to have him over at a barbecue. You could invite whoever you wanted, anybody that you know, whatever their disposition, bring him to the barbecue, and he really will have them eating out of his hand. The way he's able to combine scripture and life. When he spoke with us, I have to say his knowledge of the Second Vatican Council, of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, was fantastic. He spoke in a very catechetical way with us, very straight down the line, in very orthodox theology, and really, he answered all questions. And some of the look, I've got to keep confidentiality. Some of the bishops asked a few out there questions. I've got to say, he laughed. And then he gave a very, in cricket terms, you'd say he played with a very straight bat.
Now, are you allowed to share? Did you have a question, and what was it?
Chance.
They went by rank, or
there was one of the other bishops actually asked a question that I had in mind, and there's I have to say the Melkite bishop who spent time in the United States, Bishop Robert Rabat. He has a very similar mindset to my own, I think, especially when it comes in terms of technology and fronting up to the challenges in the 21st century. So he was able to ask a few very daring questions, which the Holy Father said, "Oh, good on you," and really gave a great answer.
It's interesting because you say that he responded, that his responses were orthodox, and you use that word to describe him. And there's no surprise from me, and I'm sure Mike and Rachel would agree that describes him. And yet, being on Catholic Twitter now for 6 months, you're exposed to so much that gives this kind of contrary view of the Pope. And that's what, in fact, a lot of, as Mike talks about, the finding of the website came from, is this idea that somehow he's not Orthodox. Have you come across these kinds of theories online, and what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, conspiracy theories have been with us from the beginning. I'd be interested to know what ancient conspiracy theories are, if it goes back to Gilgamesh or something, but certainly in the history of the church, they're never lacking. Even someone like Tertullian, sort of got really upset with the Pope because after he condemned those ladies who claimed to be prophetesses, the Montanist incident. So, and that's why we know a lot about the importance of the Holy Father and the Bishop of Rome. It was kind of the anti-witness that Tertullian was giving and really ripping into him. But, I have had, because of what circulates online and through these different ways and generally generated from the United States, even in the pews, there will be parishioners approach me after Mass sometimes and go, who's the Holy Father? I go, Pope Francis. What are you talking about? They go, are you sure? I go, absolutely. He's the Bishop of Rome. What nonsense are you spouting? But they'll be a bit quizzical. The things on vaccines, I mentioned in a homily once. I used vaccines as an example. I wasn't actually talking about vaccinations. I was just talking as an example. And they immediately thought, anti-vax and is it okay to take vaccines? And I go, absolutely, it's okay to take vaccines. What? Are you sure? I go, yes. Take them. It's common good. But there's, I don't know. Like one of the priests said to me, he said, "Well, no one had problems with measles and mumps and all the rest of it. Why is it suddenly an issue now?" And it's only because it gets stirred up online.
And that's kind of one of the things, like you talk about conspiracy theories going way back, but a lot of the ones that we're seeing now, and it's one of the things I bring up on the podcast, so people have watched it before have heard me say this, but it's the same stuff. Like Taylor Marshall's book Infiltration is the same stuff that was circulating in these tiny publications and these tiny little subcultures in the 70s. The Masonic infiltration.
What was that book about aliens coming to set up the major world religions? That was a 1970s book, Chariot of the Gods or something? Or
did people take that seriously?
Well, it's a bit like,
yeah.
Every 10 years or so, you get one of these things, like in my own case, I'm a member of Opus Dei. So I remember when the Da Vinci Code came out, I had plenty to talk about it.
It's when you started getting spray tans, right?
That's my albino sort of like.
But I think that the globalization of it due to online it's like people are hearing these things for the first time. It's as if they'd never heard a crazy conspiracy theory before and thought their way through it, but it's just,
yeah.
I mean,
there is real need for formation always, and I think we need to look very particularly at formation online. The Holy See has dedicated ever since the Second Vatican Council and before, but Inter Mirifica and then all the message each year on communications about the importance of communications, so-called what was 30 years ago new media. Now it's quite established media. So there's a basis for this. The Bishops' Conference in Australia actually put something out last year about being online and in our formation in that regard. There's still more to be done though, at a parish level. And it really is a question of simply, like a lot of things, when you do apologetics, that's all very well, but nothing can replace a solid catechetical instruction or a solid theological formation. And it's a bit the same, I think, with being online. You just need reminders of human virtue. And really, what is the intellectual virtues, especially that of prudence?
Yeah. One of the things that a topic, and I'm jumping in, but you've only got a couple of minutes left.
Sure.
Is I've been reading a lot about critical thinking skills, developing these skills. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of lacking. Like I don't want to totally jump ahead, but I find that when people are making these arguments, a lot of times they're sharing the article directly from LifeSite News or directly from, or repeating the same talking points that I'm hearing everywhere else. It's like they aren't putting their own, they're repeating these thoughts that I guess they've just placed their trust in someone. I mean, one of the things that we do at Where Peter is if somebody makes a factual claim, and as the editor, I want to see that sourced. If it's not totally general knowledge, if it's like, if Pope so and so said this, or if this happened in history, and here's the click back to the source so you can evaluate it yourself. Or if you're critiquing someone, like we've had this kind of recently, I called someone out on it. Someone wrote a very selective critique of something that I wrote, skipping the main point of what I wrote, and didn't provide a link back to our site. Whereas, I tried not to keep going back and forth, but I linked and referenced everything that this other person disagreed with. So it was sort of like they're creating this insular world, and people don't seem to know how to, or don't seem to know to verify.
We're made for truth. We're made for truth, and we need to be confident in our ability to search for the truth. I mean, John Paul II, Fides et Ratio. In a sense, this whole fake news business, it really is ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to just sloth. It's fideism, where you think it's the faith, but you can't really be bothered. You can't really be bothered. It's like, I like it, it sounds good, I'll throw it out there. I mean, we don't have a monopoly on that kind of slovenly intellectual behavior, but really, best practice, to use all the meetings terms, is in fact to do as you suggest. What's the source material for that? Is there a charitable interpretation for that? I mean, that's in philosophy. You always use the principle of charity, not because you're a Christian. Those Christians, it's incumbent upon us to do that, but because you're seeking the truth. What did the person really mean? Is there another way of seeing this? So I would always say in a dialogue and a conversation, you should be able to speak back to that person what you've heard, what you've understood, and have that person agree, yes, that is in fact what I said, that is what I believe. You go, okay, from there we can take things forward. If not, it really is just a slanging match.
And I think part of the discernment that we have to have online is when we need to step back from that slinging match and realize that the pursuit of truth isn't really happening. And now we need to go back and maybe bring in some levity with some memes again.
Yeah.
But
generally, look, I've had a very positive experience on Twitter in encountering all sorts of people. And in fact, I've made friends online, as much as you can be a friend online. With people who do think very differently, but I love dialogue. I guess it's a thing. It's a natural disposition. I actually enjoy going down to the pub and having a beer with someone who thinks very differently. There might be an atheist, they might be of a different religion. They can have their issues and everything, but there's nothing you can't sort out over, drinking moderation, a good beer. And it's amazing, because really where there's goodwill, you make a lot of ground. And in fact, because I always wear the collar, so people will come up to me and say, hey, could you pray for my grandmother? She passed away. She was a Catholic. Do you think that she's praying for me? And I go, yes, of course. And there's a lot of goodwill. It's just about, as the Holy Father asked of us as bishops, that we get amongst it, more or less. And many times, if we're with other people, we will understand what their concerns are.
Yeah, I think that so perfectly kind of encapsulates your ministry online and really what we brought to hear.
It's so refreshing to hear. Yeah. This has been I thank you so much for coming on. It feels very refreshing to hear you talk about truth in this way, to talk about goodwill in this way, to talk about balance and not being scared of differences and things like that. This is very validating for me too, because, personally, I struggle with feeling like, where are people not searching for truth anymore? Truth doesn't fear opposition and things like that. And so how I should write and stuff. And I've just been very validated this last half hour and seeing you on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and
you're welcome.
Just personally,
one document.
Sure.
One document is that Pope Francis refers to is by Pope Paul VI, Ecclesiam Suum, and I think that more or less encapsulates the way as educated Catholics in a world where people do have education, is the approach that we should take, where he does talk about what does dialogue mean.
Great. Well, maybe we'll link that.
People may not know much about the faith, but we need to explain it in a way that makes sense to someone who is intelligent.
Great.
So congratulations. You are the very first bishop to make an appearance on a Where Peter Is affiliated website, podcast, live stream, tote bag, you name it.
Setting a high bar too.
Yeah.
One of the successors to the apostles. A man who has met Pope Francis in Rome.
Okay. Stop trying to name drop, Mike. Stop trying.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bishop Richard. We'll let you go.
Off to the next thing. So, but God bless you all. And
thank you.
Great. I'll follow along. And yes, I have that meme challenge. So we'll see what I come up with.
Well, thanks.
All right. God bless you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Well, wasn't that nice?
That was great.
Nice. Oh my
Our first live guest, and he was an auxiliary bishop in Sydney, Australia. And he
was so balanced and normal and
affable.
All of you American bishops who are watching this right now.
I mean, I would move to Australia, but the thought of keeping all of my kids safe from like poisonous spiders and kangaroos,
giant spiders.
Well, you know,
too much
Mel
pressure.
Gibson's dad gave up on America, and they all moved to Australia for a while.
I think we gave up on Mel. Okay, let's.
Do you know that
All
story?
right.
And this is random, and it's just factoid. Can I tell this? Can I tell about Mel Gibson?
Sure.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna
go for it, Mike.
His father, Hutton Gibson, who died last year, I believe, and he was like 101 years old, was one of the. So the man, he was a Harvard graduate. He was a 5-time Jeopardy champion during the Art Fleming era, like pre-Alex Trebek. And he was one of the first sedevacantists in the history of the Catholic Church.
Lovely.
Well,
and
so, in the history of the United States.
And so he and his 7 kids, they were in New York or something, and it was too decadent, so they moved to Australia. And that's a whole other, that they've got. It's not just the U.S. They've got other things too. So
now he's Bishop Richard's problem. All right.
Well, no, he's dead.
He came back.
Oh, well, then never mind.
He did come back. He died in the U.S. somewhere, but anyway.
Okay,
moving on.
What was the rest of the show supposed to be about?
Because today is
it's an energy drink. It's not alcoholic. So just letting
it's an
everyone
energy
know.
drink. That's where Mike's energy is coming from tonight. Great.
Yeah, it's the Thermo Rockstar Thermo. It tastes awful. It's like the worst.
All of those energy drinks taste.
No, this
awful.
is
That's
especially awful.
Coffee.
It's like neon green, and it tastes like like watermelon, mango, onion, or something. I don't know.
But
it's
it has
terrible.
a super masculine and not at all effeminate can, right? It's like
no
black
effeminacy
and
here.
bold. It is
That's
super masculine, and you are not drinking it in a man cave. Nothing, no nonsense like that. Okay.
Imagine the pressure of not being able to eat quiche because you can't come across as too feminine. Like what? Like I had a quiche with mushroom, asparagus, goat cheese. My husband ate it. His voice went a little higher than normal.
Sounds pretty delicate to me. I don't know.
That is
dainty.
Really no French food. You only get beef if you are true.
This is
masculine.
a very American thing too, because masculinity across the world, right, in other cultures, we should have asked Bishop Richard about it. How is masculinity in Australia? Because in other
what
cultures,
it is they have the hat and the knife and the brown shirt with the buttons on it and
Australia, they have their own cowboys.
They're pretty rough and tumble. It's like a land of adventure.
I think of I don't know. I think of my Italian friends or my Persian friends.
Oh, those
and,
guys. They
so
primp and that's a whole. No. They're pretty rough and tumble in Australia and Mexico, definitely.
Well, Australia is they were forced there from Britain, right? So, and we are also inheritors of British culture. So it's like very different, like Western Puritan culture than the Persian and affectionate kind of
Westerners
Italian.
are too,
kind of puritanical sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So yeah. All right. So that was the latest round of Twitter discussions too, was being too effeminate. Ridiculous stuff that you have to think about when you don't have real problems. So
real problem. Moving on to real problems.
I do want to bring up one more point from Bishop Richard before we move on to talk about today is COVID's anniversary. But before that, I do want to bring up the point that he was talking about people in his pews across the world having the conspiracies and the problems that come from American Catholic online media. And I was really struck by that because that is part of, our message here, right, is to kind of combat some of that. And I've been saying for a while too, when I hear that EWTN is going into is setting up more infrastructure in Africa and all of that, we have to worry about the fact that the United States has a global influence. So we may think, Taylor Marshall has, 50,000 followers from the US, but what about when that trickles down globally? And so that was really interesting.
And that was one of the things that when I was talking with Pedro, he was saying that these things don't originate in Portugal. They've never heard that, but he's like, and this was, I guess, about 8 months ago, probably when we recorded that podcast. It was like in the middle of the summer. And he said that they were creeping in from the US now into Portugal. I mean, Portugal has very high English fluency, so it might have that's part of it. But yeah, if you speak English, well, and then Dawn Eden Goldstein talked about, she gave a lecture in India, in Kerala, and she said that 3 church ladies came up to her after her talk to ask her about Michael Voris, and did she know that the Pope was a heretic, because they had heard that from Michael Voris. I mean, it's
well, in my Nigerian context, because I used to be involved with a Nigerian NGO, the same thing in Nigeria. They're getting it from Western media. And of course, even more so before, needing to see like paper copies or needing to see, like televised content. Now it's internet, which is completely accessible globally. And so I just wanted to highlight that because it has caused a mess in the U.S., but the U.S. leadership and all of us really must take up our part because it's causing global issues. Trepidation about taking, what was the article we shared today? I think WPI shared it about and the Philippines kind of hesitation to take the vaccines now.
Hesitation,
U.S. conspiracies. So it's
even not even U.S. conspiracies. This was an article, I think, Mike, you tweeted yesterday. Yeah. It was an interview, and we can share the link to it. It was an interview in Crux online with Father Nicanor Austriaco. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he is a Dominican priest who is also a molecular biologist, and he's developing a COVID-19 vaccine that doesn't utilize the HEK 293 cell line, so that it has no moral qualms with it whatsoever. But he raised the point that even like the privileged conversations we have in America, where we are debating the ethics of the COVID-19 vaccines, the variety that are available in the United States now, that this is a very privileged conversation. He said, not only is American society hoarding the vaccine, they're making it intellectually, morally, and psychologically difficult for significant numbers of other Catholics around the world who are scrambling for the scraps of vaccines left over to actually take them. At the end of the day, these vaccines will end the pandemic. The pandemic is the trigger for enormous economic burdens, especially for the poorest of the poor. And so there's all of these poor, global poor who are suffering, who do not even have access to the vaccine, while we are kind of hand-wringing, asking a lot of questions, balancing moral goods. Like, these are very nuanced theological conversations that might need to take place, but the public forum is probably not the best place for those conversations to happen, especially when they are being exported around the world and causing such problems during a global pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing if you have your nose in this kind of thinking, if you're, but that's like, Catholics are not obligated to, keep up with Catholic Twitter or to keep up with every Vatican edict that's out there. And this is part of the reason why having a hierarchy is important, because the idea is, where do you turn when you need to know, can I have this vaccine or not?
Direct answer to this question, which we have direct answers for.
We have the direct answer from the CDF. And then the USCCB came out with a statement, which, while totally valid, did maybe bring up these cross considerations a little bit more heavily. And then we've seen individual bishops who've taken it a step further. A couple of them, like the one in South Dakota, put out a statement that was erroneous, basically said, you can have one of these two vaccines, but you cannot have this one, which is not what the Vatican said. And people read this and they hear about cooperation with evil, but they don't understand that just getting in a car and going somewhere is cooperation with evil. I mean, almost everything you do, assuming that you buy a product from somebody who gives money to somebody who's destroying the environment, or some nation that's unjust. I mean, that's, anytime you buy a product from China, it's remotely cooperating with some evil.
Well, and even arguably to a higher degree than the vaccines, because when we also start to piece apart just how remote the cooperation with evil is in the vaccine, it is incredibly remote, more so than buying an iPhone or, as these reactionaries like to do, tweet out on their iPhones or their smartphones, which have a higher degree.
And one of the things that I mean, and this might even be my own conspiracy theory, but it seems to me that the anti-vaccine movement, and I'm talking about the mainstream one, the one that thinks that it causes autism or that vaccines are bad for you, what their purpose is, I don't understand, but they want as few people to get vaccines as possible. They want to disrupt the whole immunization process in American health. And I think that there's a group that have exploited the Catholic Church's pro-life stance, and they don't care about, they don't like vaccines, period. So if this argument that it's tied to abortion can convince you not to get a vaccine, then great. We'll tell you whatever you need to hear, just so that you don't, as few people get vaccinated as possible. Which I mean, I can't wrap my mind around, the typical person who's anti-vaccine probably got all their shots as a kid. Did they think, I mean, it's sort of, they adopt these views based on the internet after they're older.
Some of it is the culture war thing, though.
Yeah.
And because when you see the strong correlation, right, you see the correlation on the political spectrum, it's always it's always those on the pretty far right? I don't mean like alt-right necessarily, but more right than right moderate, right? It's always those groups, right?
Well, anti-vaxxers started on the left, actually. Originally, it was part of that granola hippie health thing.
True.
But
it's been adopted, but even then, it was it was still kind of a hesitancy, like correlated to that, though, was this kind of hesitancy, like to reject the culture, right? So those kids in those circles were typically homeschooled and, rejecting like modern medicine, rejecting it's like it's definitely began, as far as I saw, living it, right? Because it's relatively new in the last couple of decades. And also I was a young mom, so it was the same crowds that were emerging. It was very much, yes, you're right, sometimes not directly tied to the right, but very much these groups of people who wanted so strongly to be countercultural, as if that gave a meaning. And a distrust of the medical community, a distrust of establishment, a distrust of government, and then it kind of somehow like adapted into this kind of coming into that political, because now it's highly political. You can't take the two apart at this point. The anti-vax movement, right, and the especially in terms of COVID, when you add the pro-life issue, is now deeply tied into being correlated to even stop the steal kind of stuff, and it's the same folks.
I think a lot of the public conversations around vaccines, like among Catholics, need to be a lot more savvy to the reality that there was a pre-existing anti-vaccination movement that was kind of poised to take advantage of a crisis like this, and they were ready to kind of move with talking points. And so that some sincere pro-life concerns or sincere convictions that pro-life people have, like, I don't want to be benefiting from an abortion that occurred. I don't like that. Like, those are things that, those are objections that are sincere among some people that can be overcome with our tradition of moral theology and guidance from pastors. But there needs to be a very savvy, like, distinction made between, like, we think that vaccines are great. As Father Austriaco said in his interview, the vaccine is a blessing from God. Like, that is, we can say that. Like, we should be able to say that. We need to be able to distinguish between that and then those who think that really they have a lot of suspicion or skepticism or hesitancy or just opposition to vaccination because of other concerns, which don't necessarily derive from moral beliefs, but more from ideas about health and wellness and those sorts of things.
And I think that's the abuse. That's one of the abuses that one of the reasons why we started Where Peter Is. It was because, and a lot of this actually predates. I mean, both of you are moms, so I'm sure you heard a lot of these maybe traditionalist routines that you absolutely have to breastfeed exclusively for this amount of time. That
I was vaccine hesitant. I planned a home birth with the baby.
But I'm saying, like, there are all these these pressures. There's but then they've also got, like, the Simca Fisher calls it the sola scriptura. The
pants
women
thing.
should only wear skirts. So there's the raw milk movement gets tied into it somehow.
It's just a very crunchy granola natural living thing, and
but they get blurred. All of this stuff kind of gets blurred over with whether or not with the faith. It's conflated, and even good things, even religious things, get conflated with the faith. And I want to say this very carefully because it can get misconstrued. I love the rosary. I try to pray the rosary. I've gone through stretches where I've done it daily. Now it's kind of like a decade here and there, but we encourage the rosary. Pope Francis has definitely encouraged. Every time Pope Francis comes out with, we're going to pray the rosary for a month, or we're going to have a special rosary day, like, we put out a rosary guide because praying the rosary is a great devotion. But Taylor Marshall wrote something to the effect recently on Twitter, like, if you don't pray the rosary daily, then you're not a good Catholic, or somehow conflated the rosary with being a good Catholic. And the crazy thing is, the rosary didn't even exist until Saint Dominic, or it wasn't the first, at least the first 1,200 years of Christendom. And on top of that, there are 20-something Catholic churches, if you include the Eastern churches, and some of them have adopted the rosary, but the rosary is strictly, specifically rooted in the Western Church. Like, it's not necessary for salvation. As beautiful as it is, it's not one of the 7 sacraments. It's, but then you go a step, 3 steps down from that to say something like, if the woman works outside if the wife works outside the home, it's a mortal sin. Or, if you don't go to homeschool, if you don't homeschool, you're going to be held responsible if your children go to hell. Yeah. I mean, just sort of.
Well, I think so. Okay. So I think it's the same. I want to make 2 points that are kind of the same. One, backing up to kind of why those in the secular arena really adopted this anti-vax. I had someone, a close person to me who adopted very strongly, like, went to courts and stuff like that to fight vaccines. And my thought with that person was kind of this realization that sometimes I think people need to feel like they're doing something good, or they're a crusader, or they're a hero, and they want to attribute something to the world, right? And I think often with the rejection of religion and within the walls of religion, the rejection of social justice causes, right? That you start to take up these kind of battles, which may not even be fully, like, in truth or necessary, or to be kind of silly, first world problems, right? you take, or even non-existent, like this vaccine thing should not even be an issue. It's science, right? You take up these battles because you want to feel like a hero. You want to feel like you're doing something good. And if you're not ready to face, like, what we know would be a real service to the world would be things like, fighting for the poor, helping, the homeless, helping marginalized groups. Racism is a big issue right now. If those are too uncomfortable for you to touch, then what does feel okay is either maybe in a secular way, picking up a crusade for vaccines, or within religious circles, picking up the idea that you should just pray 7 rosaries a day. Because that doesn't challenge you in that way. It may feel uncomfortable, but comfortable in ways it feels uncomfortable in ways you're comfortable feeling uncomfortable. That was a lot, sorry. But that is what I see most pervasively. I have a friend, again, stuck in this kind of trad ideology, who prayed 7 rosaries a day. 7 a day. Now, I'm like, dude, you get props in a sense because that's intense. But at the same time, she's also not ready to face what, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter, racism, any social justice issues, all of that she's very important to. It's just her way of living the faith is just to pray these rosaries or to homeschool her kids. And people are very unwilling to go outside their comfort to find other ways to serve the world, to find other ways to really crusade for something that cost them. And so I think that has a lot to do with it.
And
sorry.
You know who makes people feel really uncomfortable is
Me?
Pope Francis. No,
Oh.
Pope Francis.
He does.
No, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but if Pope Francis didn't make you feel uncomfortable early on, then you got
attention.
Well,
either you
because
weren't
we
paying
thought we
attention
had it figured out.
or you weren't very comfortable with Benedict.
Well, we thought we had it figured out. We had JP2, we had John Paul II, we had very well-funded apologetics movement come out of that. We had very well-funded theology of the body programs come out of that. And we thought, a lot of us Catholics who were trying to be practicing Catholics thought we had it figured out. And and I know we've dabbled into this on the website too. A lot of even what was presented to us from or filtered to us from even John Paul II was filtered to speak on theology of the body topics, unless these topics that are going to cost particularly like Westerners a lot, particularly white Americans a lot, particularly those in Western culture, because it challenges the heart of our issues: individualism, unbridled capitalism, prosperity gospel tidbits, even filtered. We may not say, oh, God just loves all, the rich more. We're not seeing that as Catholics, but you see tidbits like a demonization of the poor in various ways. And that stems from Western prosperity gospel values. So when this Pope now has come and his message, although the other ones had the same message, very similar, his message is very much kind of head on some of these Western values. It makes us uncomfortable. We thought we had it figured out. And so, but that discomfort we know in the spiritual life is a good thing too.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because one of those, I used to listen to Catholic Answers radio on my way home from work, like before Francis was elected. And I remember they'd have like open line for non-Catholics to call in. And occasionally there would be a question. I remember one in particular where a guy called in and he's like, I listen to you guys all the time. And all I ever hear you guys talking about is the church and the rules. And it's like, why don't you ever talk about Jesus? And I don't really remember what the answer to the question was, but I was sort of like, I don't know if we, and I was very much of that sort of apologetics, culturally Catholic mindset. And to me, I was thinking so much more about the following the right rules, or does that person believe in all this? Or it just instinctively, it was part of our upbringing. I remember like Melinda and I were, because like the number of kids and how like if you have this many kids, this is what they think of you.
Clearly, I'm more Catholic. Come on, Mike.
Melinda wins this one.
You know what? I think 7 is sort of like 7 is like mid-level qualifier. Okay.
Oh boy.
But I'm young. I am young.
You are young. You can get, I think,
I can get a couple
nine.
more out.
9 is the golden number. I think that once you have 9 or more kids, then you become Catholic supermom. I mean, 7 or 8, it's sort of like you tried. 6, like, okay,
You're in different circles than I grew up in. Different Catholic
I have
circles.
4, so I'm like trust but verify. Like, okay, that's an acceptable number of kids, but there could be some issues there. And how far apart are they spaced, and why is but no, but I mean, it's like all this judgmentalism, this worrying so much. I mean, you can kind of sense like, and I think some of that is the worrying about Pope Francis. Is he going to say this right? Oh no, if he says this, that's going to make people think that. Or, Cardinal Tobin was recently named to the Congregation for Bishops. And it's funny because there's also a Bishop Tobin, and depending on which wing of the church you're on, one is the good Tobin and one is the bad Tobin. Like, I've literally heard both of them called good Tobin and bad Tobin. See, we can't talk about this stuff when the bishop is on. but
he likes dialogue, so.
But I read, I read an article that was like an analysis of his selection, and it kind of gave a history, and it didn't like say this guy is awful or this guy is a jerk, but it like threw out like all of these like clues, like. Like if he, he did say this one time, and he did like, when this happened, he didn't respond. He responded like this, and it's sort of like these like, it's like, you know what? I've never met the man. I've heard the good and the bad. I wish the best. I have friends who think the world of him. But it's God's church. And I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit flew down and plucked, this bishop for that job. I mean, if that was the case, I mean, how would Bishop Umbers have ever been?
I'm kind of imagining like this big bird right now, like the Holy Spirit in the dirt and the like form of a dove, just like plucking these cardinals down. I know that has nothing to do with anything, but
and people, but I mean, that's the thing. It's sort of like, okay, they're going to be, and like, I think I work for the Bishops' Conference. Like, I know that most of them are not inspired. Most of them are overwhelmed, and they're in over their heads, and they're trying their hardest, and they probably aren't super duper at their job, but somehow the church has stayed together for 2,000 years, right? So it's sort of like, I mean, I can understand if they do something to you personally that like drive, but it's sort of like judging them based on their beliefs and based on their doing this or making that decision, or suspicions, and it's like, you know what? If you really trust that this is the church that Christ founded and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, you won't find yourself knee deep in fighting the church. Now, I mean,
or doubts.
Doubts.
That's what all the fighting is to me.
Doubts.
If you look under the surface of the fighting and the resistance to Vatican II or to Pope Francis, it is doubt. That's what it is. And they're just not wanting to verbalize it as I'm having doubts about Christ Church and whether I can trust it. But I think what Melinda was saying about how it really indicates, like, on a deep level, this kind of spiritual comfort and discomfort. I think it's true that, especially thinking of my own experience, like, I was comfortable with being uncomfortable in certain ways. Like, there were certain ways that, yep, you should be uncomfortable. Like, you should have all those children, and yeah, it's a life of discomfort, but that's what God asks you to do, so you should do it. But there are these ways that Pope Francis comes along and challenges us. And I remember, like, Laudato Si, like, the initial coverage it got was like, oh my gosh, he doesn't want us to have air conditioning, and just like the most ridiculous little details of it, because we, like, Americans can't imagine being told to be uncomfortable in ways we were not expecting. And I think that that has happened really again and again through his papacy, and actually keeps happening. Like, this trip to Iraq that just happened last weekend, like, it's during a pandemic. A lot of people, like a lot of us who really care and are fully on board with Pope Francis and his mission, are like, oh, he's going to Iraq in the middle of a pandemic. No one has had the vaccine there. I mean, he's had the vaccine, but it just seems like a very risky sort of trip. And he's challenging us again to, like, look at what he's doing in choosing to take this trip. Look at his kind of discernment process. He talked about it on the flight home, how he prayed about it and kind of went with his gut. Like his gut said, I need to go to Iraq, so I'm going to go. But that is really challenging to our kind of American notions of how we should operate in our faith. Like we should be comfortable and we should kind of shy away from discomfort, and we should look suspiciously on those who make us uncomfortable from time to time, when really the lesson I take from the Francis pontificate so far is you should be uncomfortable. That is when you have the opportunity to grow and to learn. And I mean, we weren't planning on talking about the lessons we learned from Pope Francis in the past 8 years, but that is one that just keeps recurring for me. And I don't know if you guys have any similar kind of thoughts or experiences, like what you've learned and even recently. Yeah.
Well, and we'll post the link, but reading the article, the most recent one that we wrote about that we published about the Iraq trip was from
Mark Shamoon. Yeah, he's written 2 reflections for us. He's a Chaldean Catholic. I believe he lives in Canada, but he's of Iraqi descent. And so he wrote a reflection both before the trip and after that just got posted today, and we can share those links.
Yeah, the link was great. The article was great. It summed up kind of what I was feeling too, about the trip. And it mentioned, I believe it mentioned the COVID precautions and stuff. And for me, it did make me uncomfortable too, because I was like, I hope he's safe. I hope the people are safe. But it also proved this point that he has been pretty consistent about acknowledging the common good and our obligations to ensure that through different COVID precautions, right? But the idea is that sometimes we get comfortable in having everything figured out and what it looks like. So in this particular case, there were numerous reasons that Mark lays out really well in the article, why the trip was so important. So he wasn't boxed in by his own rule. Now, again, I even feel uncomfortable saying this because I think we absolutely have to take the COVID precautions. But there are always when you're working on different truths and different issues, there seems to be very little absolutes, and absolutes are comforting. And we want to think, well, nobody should go at any point. But here's a man who said, very emphasizing his decision to go, saying, I decided, I understood the risk, I understood what was needed, and in prayer, I made this decision. And so the ability to I don't think Catholics, I think sometimes we feel comforted by rules, and we don't always like to think about, our conscience and our discernment being necessary. And so for me, it was, again, yes, definitely tied into this idea of allowing yourself to be uncomfortable and allowing yourself to not be stuck into the comforts of absolute rules, and understanding that it is about us needing to discern things with our conscience. And if the Holy Father discerned that, then I respect his discernment. That's yeah.
There was another piece that was a little similar to that, in that it made me uncomfortable, that we published. It was by Carlos Colorado. I'll see if I can find it. It was actually fairly early in the pandemic, and it was about, I'm trying to find which country it was in Central America, but there was a situation where they were under serious lockdown. Romero's Rebels is what the article with the essay was called. I'm looking at my other screen. That's why I'm looking away. But it was, it was so locked down that the people who were homeless, or the people who didn't have anywhere to live, they couldn't get any food. And so there was a group that, they put on their masks. It was in El Salvador. There was a group that decided, we're going to go downtown and we're going to feed the poor, even though there were military police everywhere. We're going to kind of try to covertly hand out this food. And there are photographs of them going through the downtown city in El Salvador and handing out these food to these poor people. Even though, there's sometimes you have to make that decision. But these are legitimate reasons, right. And you take the precautions you can while you were there. We saw Pope Francis in a mask more, even though he's theoretically immunized from
vaccinated. Yeah,
he's vaccinated, but I also want to, I guess, before we conclude, because we want to talk, just share a little bit about Pope Francis. And I talked to Mark, actually, when he submitted his, like, looking forward to the trip piece. I talked to him after I posted it, and I said, maybe you'd be interested in writing a follow-up after the trip. But the day after the trip, I talked to him and I said, no pressure if you don't want to write a follow-up, but I just wanted to share my thoughts with him and to see, just to bounce the idea off him from what my reaction was to the trip. And one of the things you notice, and I posted links to the two big homilies he gave on Saturday and Sunday. And it was interesting because these, this is a people that's been through hell and back. Their churches have been destroyed. They're driven from their homes. They've lost family and community members, either been dispersed as refugees around the world or have been killed.
And let's be clear, this is not just from ISIS, right? This is going, like, when the Iraqis...
Yeah, I mean, going back to 2003, but ISIS is really... The
American invasion that led to instability, that led to ISIS, that led to the destruction. Yeah.
But Pope Francis's message, and it was sort of like Fratelli Tutti, it wasn't like, even though Pope Francis is he says a lot about dreams, but he doesn't gloss things over. It's sort of like, here's where we are, here is where you are, here's where everyone else is. This is what you can do to make things better, to bring the world closer to Christ, to build fraternity, to build community, to bring peace. But it's up to you. And obviously it's a very unstable situation in Iraq right now. And one of the things that, I mean, yes, he expressed his sympathy and his empathy and his admiration for the people and their strength, but he didn't. The only promise that he made, he didn't promise that they were going to build again and be stronger than ever, like, because he can't make that promise. It's a minority Christian country. It's unstable. The people are poor. If something terrible could happen and they could lose it all. But the promise that they have is the promise of the cross, which...
That's the promise for all Christians.
Exactly. That's what he could promise them. That's what that's really all that we're guaranteed. That's our only promise. And I think bringing it back to that they are basically living the cross. And that's their triumph. Ultimately, that's what they can hold on to. And hopefully there will be peace, and hopefully there will be good relations, and hopefully the church in Iraq can grow again, bigger and stronger and better than ever. But even if those goals on a worldly, tangible basis don't happen, they still triumph through the cross. So.
Well, and I know we need to wrap it up, but I wanted to just add this last note on Iraq. As I was watching, for me, I don't want to center this too much on the American perspective because this is a moment for Iraq and the history and the people. But for me, I was watching some of these pictures of the devastation, right, and the bombings and the rubble that is still there from that, right? But then there was the vibrancy of the people that was so evident as well. And I don't want to idealize again the suffering these people have endured, but it also was like healing balm in a sense for me. Seeing that such devastation, these people still were. It was like the life that springs forth. That's kind of what I saw like. And for me also, sometimes I think that the American church focuses on very petty things, right? Very first world, to use that thing again, first world, even non-existent problems. But then I see, and I remember the church is universal. And it gave me hope seeing the vibrancy of the people, seeing the graciousness of the people, seeing the faith of the people. It gave me hope in the universality of the church. And so even, again, all the way from across, a couple oceans, I don't know, but it was so healing and so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, it really seemed to be a big show of solidarity. And I know that Mark wrote about that in his piece after the visit, was just the sense of solidarity from having the Pope kind of there, and he was expressing his unity with the Iraqi people. And I know that that Pope Francis in his preaching, he did turn towards the Beatitudes as a route for peacemaking, and he reflected on like the most pivotal and the most impactful moment that happened for him on the trip was listening to a mother in Karakosh, which was a Christian village that was just heavily devastated by ISIS, and her son had been killed by ISIS, and she gave a moving reflection on forgiveness. And he said that was the most impactful, like the most moving aspect of the trip for him, because this is what Pope Francis said: a mother who says, "I forgive, I ask forgiveness for them." It reminded him of being in Colombia, where he also saw so many people, women and mothers, who had experienced the murder of their children and husbands, who also forgave. And he said, "We have lost that word. We know how to insult very well. We know how to condemn, me first. But to forgive one's enemies, that is pure gospel." He said, "That's what struck me the most." And I think he just always manages to return us straight to the heart of the gospel message, which is forgiveness, even of those who persecute you. Like that is what Christ asks of us. And he points us to the witness of those in Iraq who have done that and who continue to do that. And he encourages and expresses solidarity with them. And it is really just so challenging for us who do have our Western American eyes on these things. But I think it is one of the most powerful, some of the most powerful images I think we've seen of his papacy have come from this trip. For me personally, I don't know if you guys have any.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, this and the COVID Urbi et Orbi, and
yeah, that's
emblematic. There have been some significant moments visually, but it's funny because one of the things that I did finally write about the trip to Iraq. Like I wanted to, and I think I'll write maybe a reflection a little bit down the road, but I was going back and forth with this reactionary priest who thinks that Francis is a heretic, or writing a response to what he was doing, and then in the back of my head I'm like, why is he focused on this when the Pope is making this historic pilgrimage to Iraq right now? It's like, why can't you, if you want to be a Catholic, if that's so important to you, and you want to follow what's going on in the church, why are you following this nonsense? Why aren't you following the Holy Father and what he's doing in the world and his message, instead of trying to pick apart every single little thing? So, I don't know. I need to write a retrospective for Saturday on the last 8 years, because I've got a lot of thoughts. Retrospective.
That'll be a lengthy retrospective on 8 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I think, it's funny because Pope Francis, he encourages everyone, and especially priests, to be in contact with the people and to not let themselves get wrapped up in like just this online, like kind of a reactionary posture, and to focus on the real people in front of you. And I don't know if during the pandemic, it's been easy for some to get more out of touch. It's just easier to hold things at arm's length and not allow ourselves to be challenged. But it really is, that's the challenge of Francis, is stay with the people and ministering to them and their needs. So let's see how Mike's retrospective goes.
If it gets
We're all looking forward to it. No pressure.
It might be the 10-year,
The 10-year, yeah.
We'll see in 2 years.
When he gets to his 20th anniversary, that'll be something. He's 96 years old, though. Probably won't be able to travel as much.
Around right now is we're crossing the threshold where the Francis papacy is longer than the Benedict
is longer now. Benedict didn't make it to a full.
Yeah. So get that retrospective written, Mike. All right. Well, that's all we have for this week. We'll see you all next week. Same time, same place.
Bye.
Bye.